It wasn't a perfect document. It allowed for the inhumanity of slavery and failed to guarantee women, and even men who didn't own property, the right to participate in the political process. But embedded in this document was a North Star that would guide future generations.
Welcome to the rebellion, to our refusal as women to accept this new age of tyranny.
With all due respect, I get sick and tired of the richest people
Regular order,
in this country
Mr. Chairman.
getting richer and
Regular
richer
order.
and richer.
Order.
Regular middle. We do a tax
Regular order.
middle class.
Wait a minute. Regular order.
And over and over.
We've learned again that democracy is precious. Democracy is fragile. On this hallowed ground where just a few days ago, violence sought to shake the Capitol's very foundation.
These people are not going to take it any longer. They rigged an election. They rigged it like they've never rigged an election before. We fight like hell. And if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore.
We're patriots! You're a coward, patriots. What are you so upset about? What has anyone ever done to you?
To smash windows, burn cars, shut down interstates and airports until the only option left is for the police to do their jobs and stop the madness.
I need you to understand how painful it is to be reminded every day that your race means nothing.
But what unites all of these shootings is that the weapon of choice in every case is a gun. Often a very powerful gun.
Well, I don't believe in systemic racism. I think the American system is the best system ever devised for mankind, for history. We are liberty, we are equality.
We've seen its potential. We see what it did in China. We have an escalation of cases in our own country right now.
Once-in-a-century virus that silently stalks the country. It's taken as many lives in 1 year as America lost in all of World War II.
The total U.S. death toll now nearing 170,000.
Nearly 200,000 Americans, more than 371,000 American lives lost.
Now has surpassed 400,000 people.
I cried the whole way home in the Uber tonight because I don't think people understand how stressful this job is.
Millions of jobs have been lost. Hundreds of thousands of businesses closed.
They have not given us money and they have shut us down. We cannot survive. My staff cannot survive.
My concern is that maybe in certain areas, certain people are not taking that seriously. Everyone has to take that seriously.
So anyone harassing me to wear a mask, you guys are violating federal law.
I work for Costco and I'm asking this member to put on a mask because that is our company policy. So either wear the mask.
And I'm not doing it because I woke up in a free country.
Through civil war and bitter struggles, we improved this Constitution to include the voices of those who'd once been left out. And gradually we made this country more just and more equal and more free. None of this should be controversial. These shouldn't be Republican principles or Democratic principles. They are American principles.
And welcome to the first event of the Kroc School's Democracy for All of Us series. I hope that film just got you a little bit warmed up for the conversation tonight. At the Kroc School here at the University of San Diego, we're working to end cycles of violence and shape more peaceful and more just societies through innovative ideas, teaching, and research. At the core of our mission is educating our students to confront the world's most difficult challenges. My name is Andrew Blum. I'm the executive director of the Kroc Institute for Peace and Justice here at the Kroc. The Kroc Institute is the bridge between theory and practice at the Kroc School. The core of what we do is working with and learning with those on the ground, creating real positive change. And tonight we're going to be joined by three amazing change makers, all of them working on one of our most difficult challenges, creating a stronger, more inclusive democracy. Before I say anything more, I want to invite you to join us in our conversation tonight. So I'm going to put back up on the screen the information. We're going to be using Menti tonight. So all you need to do is go to menti.com on your cell phone, put in that code. You can ask us questions. You can answer some of our questions, and we'll share a lot of that back with you after the event tonight. If you have any problems, here's a few troubleshooting tips. And you can also ask us a question on Menti if you're having any technical issues. So we're calling tonight's event Democracy After the Tempest. Our country has been through a tempest. And as we just begin to come out of that, we know that to create a stronger democracy, we can't just go back to the way things were. We can't just rebuild. We know we have to reimagine our democracy. And so tonight, we're going to start that conversation about how we all work together to reimagine our democracy and do what needs to be done to make that vision a reality. So let me introduce our esteemed guests who will be joining us for this conversation tonight. First, Mayor Nakuya Walker of Charlottesville. Mayor Walker was elected to the Charlottesville City Council in November 2017 after years of working as an advocate for racial and social justice. In 2018, she became Charlottesville's first Black woman mayor. Mayor Walker has spent most of her adult life serving those most neglected in her community, working as a substance abuse clinician, an HIV prevention educator, and a community organizer. Next, Eric Ward. Mr. Ward is a nationally recognized expert on the relationship between authoritarian movements, hate violence, and preserving inclusive democracy. Eric brings over 30 years of leadership in community organizing to his role as Western State Center's executive director in Portland. He's a senior fellow with the Southern Poverty Law Center and Race Forward, and currently co-chair for the Proteus Fund. Eric is a recipient of the Peabody Facebook Futures Media Award and is working on a forthcoming documentary about whiteness and race in America. And in all of his other free time, he's an aspiring singer-songwriter who goes under the name of Bulldog Shadow. Finally, Congresswoman Sarah Jacobs. In 2020, Congresswoman Jacobs was elected to represent California's 53rd Congressional District. At 31, Congresswoman Jacobs is the youngest member of California's delegation and the third youngest member of the 117th Congress. Here in San Diego, Congresswoman Jacobs currently serves as the chair of San Diego for Every Child. Previously, she served as the founding CEO of Project Connect, an international education nonprofit dedicated to connecting students around the world to the internet. In Congress, she serves as the freshman representative to the House Democratic Steering and Policy Committee and sits on the House Committee on Foreign Affairs and House Armed Services Committee. We're also privileged to count her as a friend and former colleague here at the Kroc School. So thank you all so much for joining us. I wanted to start with a question that I'd love to hear all of you respond to about where we are right now. A lot of people have been discussing and debating about whether what we've gone through in the past, let's say, months and years shows that we are a fragile democracy or a resilient democracy. And I wanted to get your thoughts about that. Mr. Ward, maybe you can start us off.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. I think the question around whether we are a fragile democracy or whether we are a democracy that is really starting to grow and coalesce is partly both. And what I mean by this is democracy has been an unfolding and evolving process in the United States. I actually think it's one of the most radical ideologies that has ever been created. It was made real, as John Lewis said in a speech, by the 1960s civil rights movement. In his own words, he said before the 1960s, the idea of democracy was merely an aspiration. And the Black civil rights struggle in the 1960s made it a reality. I think that that is a true statement We have to understand that the unfolding idea of democracy, the idea that people can govern their own affairs in a collective society that is transparent and accountable, is something that is new to the world. It doesn't mean that it hasn't been done in small collective, you know, homogeneous populations. But the idea that a diverse society can function in that way has only been made real through continuous struggle. With struggle has come backlash. The biggest and most challenging backlash has been the rise of authoritarian and anti-democratic movements, largely led by white nationalists, who are seeking to overthrow democracy. Let us be clear. If democracy was not a threat against white supremacy and white superiority, white nationalists would not have been working so hard over the last several decades to undermine it and destroy it. Democracy is worth looking at. Democracy is not perfect. It is continually unfolding. But we should not be so quick, particularly Black, Indigenous, and people of color, to turn our backs on what our ancestors fought and died for nearly 7 decades.
Thank you, Mr. Ward. Mayor Walker, I'd love to hear your thoughts as well.
Yes, and thanks for having me. Just one quick correction on pronunciation. It's Nakaya.
Thank you.
So just want to, I think we're still in a very fragile space. You know, Charlottesville, we talk a lot about, you know, it has come up a lot after January 6th, what happened here in 2017, which we have coined the Summer of Hate. And to see what occurred on January 6th happen, knowing that, you know, we could have predicted it based on what occurred here, and that there's been very little change. As a native to Charlottesville and a Black woman, we have been crying out in our little corner of the world that the injustice is far-reaching. And I say often here, in a place that is assumed to be very liberal and progressive, that dealing with individuals like those who stormed the Capitol is a little bit easier. And that is, I think, our bigger challenge, is the fact that those individuals are just coming to light because they have a reason to come back to light, because things are potentially changing, and the individuals who have kept those things kind of, you know, under the surface are now processing what does change look like. In all of that, I feel that we, Black people, low-income people, other individuals who have been marginalized, are still waiting for white people in power to tell us what they're going to allow us. I often say, what does liberation look like if it's being defined by other people? And when you're talking about a democracy for all of us, that is our major challenge. Because when people are willing to storm the Capitol, when they are willing to hold up symbols that show hate, you know exactly what you're dealing with. I'm finding during my tenure here on council, and from coming from an activist perspective and background, and working really in those communities, that when you talk about going from theory to practice, that little is changing for us, and all of it's being defined by individuals in power, and you know, it's not very often that those individuals are the individuals that are affected by the oppression. And that's still very much the fact. So that means that we are still in a very, very fragile state. And those major events like what occurred on January 6th just highlight, and for me shows, what individuals are willing to risk to maintain the power that they've had for centuries.
Thank you. Congresswoman Jacobs, your thoughts?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's so great to be back here at USD. I think the answer is both. And I think that we have seen that when we look at fragility, what we often think about is the effectiveness and legitimacy of institutions. And we've seen both of that erode over the last 4 and longer years. And I think a lot of us looked at the last 4 years and saw that the normative power, the institutions were not as strong as we thought they were in keeping in check a potential authoritarian. And yet at the same time, we did have a resilience. They didn't completely crumble. And I actually think the events of January 6th are a perfect microcosm of the broader challenge. So I was actually in the House chamber when the attack happened, and we saw the fragility in the fact that there were people who were instigated and incited by the president of the United States to believe a lie about the election and come to violence and breach our symbol of democracy to overturn an election and a constitutional obligation. That was the fragility. And yet, later that night, we all came back into the House chamber and fulfilled our constitutional obligation. And on January 20th, Joe Biden became president, and that's the resilience. And so I think we see both right now, and I think that actually gives us a template for how we can move forward.
Congresswoman Jacobs, let me stay with you and ask you a question in particular. I saw a tweet of yours where the first 3 Wednesdays that you were in Washington, D.C., you experienced an insurrection, an impeachment, and an inauguration. So first of all, we're very happy that you were able to be here with us tonight. But I wonder now that maybe things are settled down just a little bit, what do you see as the key things the new Congress, the new Biden administration can do to strengthen our democracy? What are your top priorities from the federal level?
Well, I think that there are a lot of lessons we can learn from when we've seen these kinds of violent incidences and polarized societies around the world. And so, first of all, I think it's incredibly important that we continue to hold accountable anyone who incited, encouraged, or committed acts of violence on January 6th or leading up to January 6th. I know that you can never really move forward if you don't get that accountability piece right. And then I think that it's not a coincidence that a lot of this happened during this global pandemic, because the fact that the United States government was unable to contain this virus led to people feeling like our government institutions couldn't be trusted, that they weren't effective, they weren't legitimate. And so we need to address COVID-19. We need to get relief and assistance out to people immediately. And then we need to look at the broader challenges that we have seen. We need to fix our democracy, whether it's in addressing voting rights, in making DC a state, and having Puerto Rico have a referendum on whether they want to become a state. Looking at other kinds of institutional factors around independent redistricting commissions, how we finance our elections. All of those pieces. But then we also need to look at the enabling environment that allowed some of these lies and extreme ideologies to spread, and make sure we're really creating some foundational rules for social media. We often see that it's when you have this technological and communication changes that you have moments like this. And so it's incumbent upon us in Congress to start creating those foundational rules so that our social media ecosystem is really contributing to the kind of society that we want and not exacerbating the challenges that we have.
Thank you. Mayor Walker and Mr. Ward, you heard Congresswoman Jacobs talk about learning some lessons. And your cities experienced violence that in some ways is similar to what we saw, and in some cases are still experiencing violence similar to what we saw January 6th. So I wanted to ask you what you have learned about how you would address that kind of violence, how you move forward after those kinds of violent incidents. Mayor Walker, maybe you can get us started there.
So the first thing you have to be prepared, which we see that on January 6th, that didn't happen either. In 2017, it's being on the ground. I mean, the world saw the images, but looking over your shoulder, turning around, wondering why police officers were just standing there looking, at the violence. That is something that we saw again on January 6th, of individuals storming the Capitol, being able to get inside, all the potential of what could have went wrong. We saw that on the ground in Charlottesville. I would I've said for years that if just a firecracker had went off, a lot of people would have thought that was gunshots, and how many lives that we would have lost without it even actually have been a gunshot. So that's number one, is being prepared. And you have to honestly ask yourself, how does a coordinated effort, where today we're asking how many different departments from around the country had law enforcement personnel present on January 6th. Our question here was, of the law enforcement who was present, why didn't they act? Why didn't they protect individuals? Why did they allow that? And when you're talking about the institutions that are supposed to protect and serve, and when they make decisions about who deserves to be protected, and especially when you're talking about communities, Black communities, low-income communities, what Hispanic communities experience, where they don't get protection and it's often abuse, that is our major challenge, what we haven't figured out. The next challenge after that, if there is true accountability, and we haven't experienced that in Charlottesville yet, and from the discussions and news reports out of DC, it doesn't seem like that we may have that level of accountability if the Republican Party has any say that we deserve from the insurrection on the 6th. After you move from accountability, then you have to acknowledge, how did that occur to begin with? And we go back to century-old systems that have been in place, that have been okay with oppressing individuals, particularly Native people, Black people, and how that always spreads to an othering of anyone who doesn't fit into those standard categories. And then when you're talking about who represents those in power, you are always challenged by what individuals will allow for change. In Charlottesville, we are still having debates. Once August 2018 rolled around and we did not have individuals in the streets like we did on August 2017, our citizens began to want requests just to move forward. And particularly Black citizens kept saying there's no moving forward, because the place we were at did not work for a lot of us. And so you have the majority, who have been in the past considered the most powerful because of their influence, because of their wealth, being able to shift the conversation from this conversation that we should have had way before 2017 to a discussion about the return to normal. And I hear some of that, and it stirs up fear in me when I hear President Biden talk about unity. Because what does unity look like with individuals who are okay with storming the Capitol with zip ties in their hand? And until I hear an answer that's satisfactory for that, I don't understand how we can truly move forward. We may be in a better place than we were under 45, but that doesn't mean that we are actually headed towards more perfect union.
Mr. Ward, in Portland, these challenges are acute even right now. And so I wanted to see how you think about how you move through and maybe forward as the violence is even still happening.
Yes. So we are merely a couple of months away from the 4-year anniversary of the killing of 2 individuals on a light rail. 3 white men were attempting to put themselves between a white nationalist who was threatening 2 young black women on the light rail system, one who was Muslim. And in his frustration of not being able to get to these 2 young women, he slashed the throats of all 3 of these men. These were men who didn't know each other. They were strangers who decided to stand. And 2 of them died there on the floor of that light rail system. What's important to know about that story, right, is the courage of these 3 individuals, but the fact that the killer had engaged in a similar tactic the night before, had attempted to attack a black woman, had been arrested by the police, and so had she for defending herself, and he was released, and the next night he committed these murders. We should understand that the first thing that needs to be done is that we have to deal with the unconscious racial bias in law enforcement that is preventing it from understanding that white nationalism is a national security threat in the United States. Here we are merely weeks after January 6th in an attempted insurrection to overthrow US democracy. 140 law enforcement officers injured, one who was maimed and lost his eye, another who was killed by being beaten in the head with a fire extinguisher. Merely weeks after that, we are already talking as if the white nationalist alt-right threat is merely an aberration. We in the Pacific Northwest, who have struggled against the white nationalist movement, can tell you that it is not an aberration. And if you do not learn how to manage this threat, what you saw on January 6th, you should understand, was merely a rehearsal. It is a social movement that is as serious as any other social movement. And if we underestimate it, it is because of our own arrogance. So there are 3 things that I would recommend. The first is that all of those who were involved in the insurrection attempt should be given a specific amount of time to come forward and to share what they know. They should seek legal advice and do so. But whoever refuses to come forward should be prosecuted civilly and criminally by the full extent of the Department of Justice. Those who do come forward in a timely fashion should be shown some leniency. If a person wasn't injured, or if they were not involved in the stolen theft of federal property, right, or the injury or killing of others. That's the first piece. The second, though, is that we need a fairness doctrine in the United States. It is time to rein in news, or what appears to be news, but is merely opinion, without offering an alternative opinion. It is that siloing of opinion being cloaked as news that is helping to spread this idea, this knowledge desert that is dividing Americans and creating 2 different realities. The third is to understand this, though. If we want to understand why this white nationalist alt-right movement is so successful, we have to be courageous enough to pick up the mirror. Yes, we can spend our time pointing our fingers at the white nationalist movement. But the truth is that for nearly 3 decades, the white nationalist movement has been allowed to grow in the United States without being contested. Not only mainstream America, but including racial justice and human rights civil society, has denied that this movement was a threat that needed to be taken seriously. We are also at fault for what occurred on January 6th. Certainly, we weren't the white nationalists who engaged in violence, but our silence around this movement, our disdain that it wasn't important, left all of our communities vulnerable. I think of this white nationalist here in Portland several years ago who was involved in a demonstration. He was being harangued by a citizen reporter with a camera who was demanding, why was he here in Portland? And the person with the camera kept saying, no one wants you here. The mayor doesn't want you here. These protesters don't want you here. No one wants you here. Why are you here? And what this white nationalist said in response, all of us should hear. He said, yes, I heard that we're not wanted here, but the truth of the matter is that Portland is a city with a shrinking Black population by both whole number and percentage. He looked at the guy with the camera and he said, so you can say you don't want us here, but the fact of the matter is that you are doing something we could never get away with. You are actually disappearing the Black population here. In short, he was calling us hypocrites. If we truly want to defeat the white nationalist movement, we have to understand that this is a fight over the imagination of the American public. And we do not spark an alternative to white nationalist imagination unless we deal with the underlying unconscious bias that segregates our societies. Until we take that on, we are merely hypocrites, and white nationalists understand that. So in truth, the lesson is, from January 6th, is that we must commit ourselves to taking on the systems of white supremacy and unconscious bias. And we must also contend and manage the white nationalist movement. And the tools to take on both are not the same tools. So we have to double our efforts. We need government to step up, but we need the rest of civil society to step up as well. When government is aligned in Portland, Oregon, the impact of these incursions by the alt-right on our community are very small. When government is unaligned, the impact and the violence has been great. Alignment around values is what is needed to contend with this movement.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that personal experience that you've really lived in Portland. Congresswoman Jacobs, I wanted maybe you to follow up because you're there in the Capitol. You were at the inauguration. I know you heard President Biden's call for unity. Mayor Walker spoke to that a moment ago. There is this call for unity. I think from my own work and from your work and from everyone's work, we know that requires accountability. We know that requires addressing these past oppressions that we've heard about already tonight. So for you, what is that working toward unity with accountability, with what might that look like?
It's a really good question and something I've been thinking a lot about. First, I think we have to be very clear that we need the accountability piece before we can get to the unity piece. And whether that means making sure that every single person who was involved in the insurrection is somehow held accountable, making sure that we're holding accountable the political leaders, the media leaders who perpetuated and broadcast the lie and incited the violence. I don't think we can ever get unity until we have that accountability. And one of the things I've been calling for is a truth commission for the events of January 6th and leading up to them, but also for the whole history of the United States, because we've never really had that reckoning with our own story. And until we do that, I think it's hard for us to come together. And I think we need to tell the story of both the glory and the gory. You can't have one without the other. And as we do that, we can work together to create a common narrative that we can all share and all build on to move forward. It means we need to have programs that focus on addressing the racial and economic inequality that we have in this country and being very intentional about that, because we know that that is a huge component of what's happening right now. And so we need to have these tough conversations as individual communities, rebuild some of these frayed and strained relationships, but do it in a way that doesn't paper over the differences, doesn't paper over what we've had in our history, but uses that as a way to bring people together around a common narrative and move forward. And that's why I think we need this Truth Commission. I think we need to create a memorial to the events of January 6th so that we cannot in the future have people retell the story in a different way that changes what we all know actually happened. And we need to look at lessons from countries around the world who have had to do this kind of work, have had to dig deep and find a way to come back together after being really divided.
Mayor Walker, I wanted maybe you to speak to something that Mr. Ward said, which I found quite interesting, which is, when government is aligned, and management of these issues is much more possible, because you were an advocate and an activist for many years, and then moved into a political position in Charlottesville. So, how do you see are the most productive ways that civil society and government actors can work together to really address some of these challenges?
Yeah, so I'm going into my fourth year, and I'm learning more and more that it's going to take a complete overhaul of the system of government, and it's going to require that we have people in positions of power that haven't been in positions of power before. I am in the position of mayor for the city of Charlottesville. We are a weak mayor system, and I have 5 colleagues who are all white. And the council before this one, with former Vice Mayor and Council Member Wes Bellamy, that was the only time in the history of the city that there have been 2 Black members of City Council. And it speaks volumes that it's hard, even among people who are saying they want change, to relinquish that power. So I spent a lot of time in my position because by nature I am an activist. There's a local individual who just on his show a week or so ago said that I can even advocate for people where I can be mayor, but that you can't be both. And if we are talking about the type of changes really taking root that you are having this series for, that people around the country are having, it's going to require that people relinquish that power and allow citizens to lead, and particularly marginalized citizens. That is a challenge, because here there's still the "we know what's best" movement. Our population is over 70% white. It's a very wealthy population of individuals. And, the University of Virginia is here, that whole story, and the power and influence that they have over the area. And so it's very difficult for the individuals who've been affected by centuries of oppression to be heard and listened to even today. And that is what I spend the majority of my time fighting for and still advocating for, even from my position.
So this is the last question I wanted to put to you before we take some questions that our audience has proposed. Mayor Walker, you just mentioned that people all around the country are having this conversation right now. I think, the reason almost 600 people signed up for this event tonight is people are hungry to understand what can they do? What can they do concretely to be part of the solution? Mr. Ward, on your website, you say, "Together we defend democracy." So I wonder if you could start us off. What does that mean for your community? What are you asking of your community, or what are some concrete things your community members can do?
Yeah. So we are asking people to engage in the following actions. The first is simply this: to connect with your elected officials. This is something you can do as an individual. It merely takes an email or a text, but it doesn't matter whether that person represents you is the school board member all the way up to the President of the United States. You need to reach out to them. You need to let them know, right, that this authoritarian movement called the alt-right, driven by white nationalism and QAnon, is a concern that you want them to take seriously. They need to know that, and they need to know that they have your support. The second is you have to be an organization. It doesn't matter whether it is a college club or a quilting group, a real estate association, or a social justice organization. You cannot take on this work by yourself. You have to be in community, and that means being an organization. That organization should be an organization that understands that it needs to address bias in its community, and it needs to be able to respond by drawing a moral barrier against hate violence, and hate groups. That means speaking out as an organization. That means being visible. If you aren't visible, all you are doing is telling white nationalist groups that they have more space in your community than they actually do. The third is we need to ensure that legislation, policies, and practices that we are putting forth or are already on the books, right, actually seek to address the problem. We cannot criminalize the entire white nationalist movement. We cannot criminalize, right, a third of Republicans who believe in QAnon. There has to be a fuller answer than simply criminalization. That means we have to compete for some of this constituency. That doesn't mean ignoring accountability, but it means not overly relying on criminalization. Other forms of action that can take place are de-radicalization. It can be addressing the underlying issues that white nationalists use. And I want to draw a distinction here. We're not talking about the idea that somehow economic inequality drives people into the white nationalist movement. It's simply not true. But it does create an excuse, and it creates an avenue for white nationalists to try to exploit dissent. If we are serious about this, we will address the economic inequality that is happening in our society. We will roll up our sleeves to address COVID-19 and its impact on communities of color, small businesses, and others. But what we will have to do is we will have to continue to strengthen democracy. And that means creating systems that allow fair and free elections. We live in one of the biggest democracies in the world. It is ridiculous that it takes a week for our country to be able to certify elections. We have a lot of work to do. And I don't want to buy into the myths of the Republican Party that the elections were stolen. It wasn't true. But we should have election systems that clearly show that there is no way that that is possible. So again, building democracy, being an organization, and letting your elected officials know at all levels where you stand on these issues. Those are the first three things that you can do.
Congresswoman Jacobs, I wonder if you could speak to that as well. You have a new constituency here in San Diego. If they come to you and say, how can I be part of the solution? What might you tell them?
It's a great question. And the first thing I'll say is get involved. Because I actually think that the biggest division in our country is not between the extreme right and the extreme left. It's between the people who are active and paying attention to politics and the people who aren't and don't think that it affects their lives. And part of why things have gotten so polarized is because the people who are the loudest, the people who are the most involved, also tend to be the most extreme. And everyone else is kind of not paying attention and not getting involved. And my team will probably be a little bit mad at me, but you really should call my office, call your elected officials. It really does help. When I introduced a letter to the acting Secretary of Defense at the time, asking him to hold anyone accountable who was in the military or formerly in the military for participating in the insurrection, I did so because I heard from hundreds of constituents who called my office saying that they themselves were members of the military, were veterans, and that they were dismayed at all of the reports they were seeing of their fellow veterans being involved, and they felt like it affected their honor. And that gave me the legitimacy to write that letter and to say, hey, I'm representing these people. They've actually reached out to me and asked me to do this. So call your elected officials, get involved in campaigns. Often you are left with only 2 people to vote for, but you need to get involved way before that happens, so that you can have a say in even who is running and who is getting through the primary system. There's a lot you can do. And then I always tell young people who want to get involved, find a problem that you really want to solve, and then find all the different ways you can solve it and where you can have the most impact, and then work on that. And I find a lot of people get too focused on wanting to be something and not wanting to do something. But if you stay focused on that problem and trying to solve it, I think that you'll be able to be really impactful in addressing that, and always having an equity lens is doing it, but also remembering that every issue is an equity issue. And so you don't just have to work on the thing that you think in your mind is what is the most, biggest issue about racial injustice or economic injustice right at this moment. If your passion is something else, bring that lens to whatever issue you're passionate about solving.
Thank you. I want to turn now to questions from our audience, and thank you everyone for your questions. So I'm going through them right now, and I'll just ask some of them in the time we have. I really like this question. As you look 5 to 10 years into the future, what does our democracy look like? Where is it stronger or weaker than today? Mayor Walker, you said you've been at this mayor thing for 4 years. So maybe go out 10 years from now, and where do you think Charlottesville is? Where do you think the country might be, 10 years from now?
Yeah, there are some days that I'm more hopeful than others. But what I am most hopeful about that's happening in Charlottesville, like many places around the country, there was we had an increase in violence in some of our lower income, communities, and during the pandemic, and putting the call out to community members, persistent calls to show up, to create nonprofits, to show up, even if you were just, a day before involved in activity that maybe you shouldn't have been involved in. The response to that over the past month and a half of people who normally are not engaged, or think that they are part of the solution, which I believe they are the solution. Those type of changes, getting out of their way, saying, what do you need? What do the people who are in pain, who are acting out of that pain in the community, what do they need? I think that's how we change things. I'm really good at that. I'm really good at saying, what do you need? And getting out of the way after you tell me, and coming back into the room when you tell me I need to be in there again. And unless we have more of that, I'm a little leery about the possibilities, because here, even though we had our event that was kind of the awakening for us in 2017, the questions that the rest of the country are asking as a result of January 6th, we're still debating those questions. We're still having, those conversations. When it gets down to what people really need, we are still struggling with providing those resources. We are still, okay with people living in housing that hasn't been repaired. We're okay with, pushing in, people based on income out of the community. When those conversations that really matter happen, I think, one thing when Mr. Ward was talking that I thought about was how many of our community members, and I'm sure this happened across the country, on January 6th, based on race, you could see different posts being shared on Facebook. And one that came out of the Black community was that this is not our fight. When you're talking about unity and you have a population of people that are quick to remind that we didn't cause this, it's never really about us, and that we shouldn't jump into this. Those are things that we really have to figure out how to answer those questions honestly. So what gives me hope is that people who are the answers, who've been sidelined for so long, having the option to figure out the solutions that their community needs. And if we can figure out that across the country and actually provide those resources, I think healing is actually possible. But until then, I'm a little weary.
Yeah, I think many of us can empathize with a roller coaster of feeling a little bit better about things and then a little bit more pessimistic about things. Mr. Ward, there's a couple questions here that I think I would really like you to weigh in on. One of them is extremist white nationalists often claim that establishment politicians deny them a voice in our democracy. How might we address those concerns? And then a kind of a different question on the same note was, you saw in the video that there is so much pain out there. Congresswoman Jacobs talked about the pain COVID has caused. So how do we, engage with those people who are feeling that pain, even when there's all kinds of things we might disagree with them about?
Yeah, I think it's important to acknowledge the pain and social alienation that exists in this society, and it impacts all of us. It may impact us differently, but all of us knows what that feels like. We are in a moment right now where tens of millions of Americans are out of work. Small businesses are under huge pressure. People are losing their homes. We live in a country right now because of the failed policies of the last administration. 1 out of every 735 Black people has died in the last 11 months from COVID-19. 1 in every 595 Indigenous people in this country has died from COVID-19 in the last 12 months. Let me say that again, because those numbers are very real. 1 out of every 735 Black people in the United States has died from COVID-19 in the last 11 months. We are in a moment where it calls for real seriousness. And this cosplay of dressing up, right, to engage in political violence doesn't answer any of these problems. They do not heal social alienation. What it is nihilism. And at some point, we have to grow up and roll up our sleeves and walk away from that nihilism. We have a country that needs us right now. It needs our imagination. It needs our energy. And this is not about left or right. This is not about conservative or liberal. This is not about Democrat or Republican. This is about inclusion and aligning our values. We all want safe communities. We want a better future for our children. We want to be safe and we want to be prosperous. That is not predicted by political lines, but by the moral principles that we should be living in this country. We have lost our way, and we cannot blame this on simply being alienated. People have been alienated in our society for a very, very long time. And I will say this, that the civil rights movement in this country, including Black Lives Matter, has delivered more tangible benefits to white America than the white nationalist movement ever has. Do not believe the empty lies and promises of the white nationalist movement. What it leads to is death, chaos, and unfulfilled promises. We are in a moment right now where the white nationalist movement is attempting to make us believe that we are in the midst of a civil war or a race war. It's simply not true. This country has gotten stronger when we align together. I'm actually very hopeful about the future. I think we've already won. I see it each and every day when I'm walking around my community. I know that this is not the country that my father had to live in. And it is certainly not the country that my grandmother had to live in. This is a moment where we have to understand that life in 2020 America, in terms of racial justice, while incomplete, is better than life was in 1920, and certainly better than 1820. We need to celebrate what our ancestors have done to get us to this point, and we need to carry the burden of ensuring that the next generation are able to sing their own song. So we need to be serious about this moment. It doesn't mean we shouldn't be afraid. It doesn't mean that we can't understand that we have real challenges ahead. But what we have to understand is that we are strong people in this country. Our diversity is strength. Our ability to imagine the future is strong. We just have to believe in one another. And instead of leading with suspicion, it's time to lead with generosity. It's time to lead with abundance. We've had enough of scarcity. Too many lives have been lost because of scarcity. It's time to do something new. And it's time to move into an inclusive America, one that centers people, that is transparent and is accountable. We can meet the needs of all Americans. We do not have to suffer like this. It's suspicion that keeps us from aligning together. So we need to get serious about economics. We need to get serious about opportunities in the future. And we need to support those elected officials who are trying to move tangible policies that make that a reality. That's the job ahead of us. And one other thing, check on your neighbor, leave them a note, make a phone call, see that they are okay. If we can't talk to the person who lives next door to us, how do we talk to the person across town?
Thanks. Congresswoman Jacob, this is going to be the last question I ask, and then I'll let each of you, make any kind of closing remarks that you'd like to leave us with. But I'm going to paraphrase the question a little bit here. I know that sometimes when a problem seems overwhelming, you go and look for bright spots. You go and look for, okay, well, who is making progress on this, even with all the challenges? So in terms of creating connections between people who disagree, in terms of sort of building more trust and more cohesion in our society, are there any kind of good news story, bright spots that you've seen as you've sort of walked around your district or talked to people here in San Diego?
Absolutely. Just today and yesterday, I visited 3 of the COVID vaccination sites across my district. And the amount of people who have stepped up to volunteer, who have given of their time, organizations and institutions who are doing everything they can to serve our community, I think shows that even in these dark times, even as all of us are exhausted from the sacrifice that COVID has extracted from us, people are still willing to give and to step up and to do what they can to help each other. And to me, that is incredibly inspiring, and it's why I have hope for the future. I think that there are a lot of areas and issues where we have been able to see folks come together. And another thing that gives me a lot of hope is young people. When we saw the way that they were able to change the conversation on gun violence by talking about their own personal experiences and bringing their classmates along from all parts of the country. When we see how young people have changed the conversation around climate change and made it about a personal impact to themselves and to our generation. And for me in Congress, I haven't been there for 4 years yet, only 4 weeks. And what a 4 weeks it's been. But there are a number of other young members of Congress from both sides of the aisle. And we all know that we have to do something differently. We can't just keep having the same conversations and trying to deal with things the same way. I was just on a panel yesterday with Congressman Peter Meyer from Michigan, a Republican, one of the 10 who voted for impeachment, actually. And we were talking a lot about what kinds of things we both need to do in our own parties, across our parties, to be able to move our country forward. And so I do think there's a lot of hope. And, as we heard, like call your neighbor whether or not if they are your same political party. Just reach out to a stranger, show those kindnesses. And I think that we've really seen that has gone a long way during this pandemic. And I think that will be the start of how we move forward.
So I did want to give each of you a chance just to leave us with one parting thought. Maybe sometimes I tell my students, a one breath thought. So what can you tell us in sort of one breath to leave us with? So maybe Mayor Walker, you can get us started with your final thoughts.
Yeah. Well, again, thanks for having me. If I could leave, and especially the 600 people watching who are either in positions where they are in leadership roles or will be soon, it's to trust the community members, even if they don't call the leaders or call their elected officials. It's really about figuring out and being persistent on how to engage with them. I believe that a lot of the solutions that we haven't come up with is because we haven't been asking the right people. And so that's what I would leave you with, is just trust that, especially the people who've been oppressed, marginalized, that they have the answers. And they may not look like you think they should look. They may not look how, when you're in the classroom and you're talking about it from the theory perspective, what you came up with. But if you trust that process, then I think we move towards actual healing. In a locality like Charlottesville, where 25% of our families struggle to meet their basic needs, and we haven't figured out the answer to that. Everything else that we've discussed tonight, it goes completely over your head when you're trying to figure out how to make sure your light switch, when you flick it, lights come on, that you have a door to enter into, that you have food. And I think when we're having these conversations about how to solve the problems of the world without starting at those most basic, that most basic foundation, then we lose a lot of the people who actually have, the solutions within them. One thing that I posted after the inauguration, and that I've talked to people about quite a bit, was that we love to hang on to stories about the Amanda Gormans of the world. Amanda said, you know, I'm a Black girl descended from slaves who, you know, but raised by a single mother who is reciting a poem for the President of the United States. And it's so easy. Amanda was everywhere on everything. And my question to people was, how many Amanda Gormans did we kill the spirit of today? And I often show up at the party and I'm not as optimistic as everyone else who shows up. Because while I was, you know, raving about Amanda too, I thought about all the young Black girls and women who never make it, who we never see their full potential. And we don't think about their daily assaults that kills their spirits. And so I know that's more than one breath, but that's what I would leave everyone with.
Thank you so much. Congresswoman Jacobs, your final thought.
I think it's really easy right now to feel like things are hopeless and that there's nothing you can do. But I actually think that's the easy way out. And a lot of people, when I started running for office, they're like, why would you even want to go to that place? It's swampy. But the honest answer is that nothing's going to get better unless we work and make it better. And so if you feel yourself getting dejected, if you feel yourself starting to feel like nothing's ever going to get better, you can never fix it, everything's just broken beyond repair, push yourself to get involved and to do something more, because we need you. We need you right now. We need your voice. And just the way you are enough to start repairing the world.
Thank you for that. Mr. Ward, the final word for this evening.
Final word. You know, when I was a kid, I mean, we grew up very, very poor. And when I was a kid, we used to play this game called If I Were. And one of the questions that would come up, right, is if I were in the midst of the civil rights movement. And we would argue as kids about what we would and wouldn't do, what we would or wouldn't put up with. We didn't quite understand the choiceless choices of our parents and our grandparents. And that question has always haunted me. What would I have done in the midst of the 1960 civil rights movement? There may be folks on here asking themselves or have wondered that same question. What would you have done in the midst of the 1960s civil rights movement? Well, I realized about 10 years ago that we no longer had to ask that question, that whatever it is I would have done in the midst of the 1960 civil rights movement, whatever it is that you would have done is exactly what you will do when you leave this call today. You deserve to be taken seriously by this world, but you have to take yourself serious first. You have to understand that white nationalists don't bring racism or anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, homophobia, and other forms of prejudice to our communities. They merely organize the bigotry that already exists. Your job is to remove that bigotry, address it, and you do so by standing up. If you choose to stand up, to move, to say one thing, to do one thing, then I say to you all tonight, welcome to the 21st century civil rights movement.
Thank you so much for that and for all of those final thoughts. It was just a great way to end our conversation tonight. I really want to thank all three of you for joining us tonight, for your honesty tonight and your willingness to confront these challenges head on in an honest way that I think our audience will definitely appreciate as they think about what they heard tonight. And most of all, I want to thank you for the work you are doing, you will do, to strengthen our democracy, to make it a more inclusive democracy, to make it a more just democracy. So thank you all so much. To our audience, I want to give you one more chance to get onto Menti. We're going to ask you some final questions. We're going to get some of your final thoughts. And as I said, we're going to share some of that back with you. So please take a moment, if you are on Menti, to go back and answer some of those questions. I want to remind you also that this is the first event in a series that will be February 25th. And we're really excited about that event because we're going to take all of the rich issues we heard about tonight and think and talk about what that means for our city here in San Diego, what we like to call America's finest city, even though we know we have so much work to do right here at home. We're excited that at that event, we're going to have Francine Maxwell, the president of the San Diego chapter of the NAACP. We're going to have Tad Parson, who is the CEO of the Burnham Center for Community Advancement. And we'll have another panelist to confirm soon. So please join us for the February 25th event. Finally, I'd like to thank all of you. As I said, almost 600 people showed up for this event. So thank you for being here. Thank you for taking the time. And most of all, thank you for the work I know you're going to do as you move forward from tonight to build a stronger, more inclusive democracy here in the US. So thank you and good night.